Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just please take a minute to really sort of get centered for our training today. Limit distractions, get a beverage if you need it, get some note-taking materials. And if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, pronouns, location, organization, and one thing that's bringing you joy. We are going to have breakout rooms later in the session. So if you would please take a minute to rename yourself in your Zoom name with a 1 if you prefer an English speaking breakout group, or a 2 if you prefer a Spanish speaking breakout group. So if you look at your little picture, there are 3 dots in the upper right hand corner. If you pull that down, one of the choices is rename, and please put in the beginning of your name a 1 for an English speaking breakout room and a 2 for a Spanish speaking breakout room. And please feel free to speak in the training in whatever language is most comfortable for you. And as the interpreter said, please speak in the language that you selected for your interpretation channel if you selected it. Just a friendly reminder, if you only speak English and not Spanish, please join the English interpretation channel so that if people speak in Spanish in this training, you'll also be able to understand them. Now I will hand it over to Kezia for a quick intro.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Corey. I'm Kezia Scales, the Director of Policy Research for PHI, and I just wanted to take a quick moment to welcome you all and thank you for being here today. So today's session on convening and mobilizing a strong coalition is the first in a series of 3 advocacy sessions happening over the next 3 weeks. Next week at this time, just to let you know, the Frameworks Institute will present a session on communicating the value of care work. And in 2 weeks, again, same bat time, same bat place, the Advocacy Institute will be back to take us through building the relationships we need to win. This series is part of the 3-year Essential Jobs, Essential Care Multi-State Advocacy Initiative, which has been generously funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and the John A. Hartford Foundation. In this initiative, as you may know, PHI is partnering with IMPART Alliance in Michigan, the New Mexico Caregivers Coalition, and the North Carolina Coalition on Aging, and advocates like you across all 3 of those states to advance policy reforms that improve compensation for direct care workers, elevate workforce innovations related to training, career advancement, and much more, and strengthen data collection on this essential workforce. We have seen amazing collaboration and action and results over the last couple of years of this initiative, building on and amplifying decades of previous work, as well as complementary collective advocacy efforts. Now, as we're getting into year 3 of the initiative, we wanted to take the opportunity to build our advocacy capacity overall even more through this series of advocacy skills building sessions that have been designed around your expressed training needs and preferences. So with that, I again want to extend my gratitude to all of you for joining us today, and also to the Advocacy Institute for leading today's session. And I will hand the mic back to them to introduce themselves and take it from here.
Excellent, thanks. So we are going to launch a brief poll as a part of our pre-survey. If you could please fill that out, and then you can close it when you're done. We're not going to be sharing the results in this training. It's just for our assessment purposes. So really appreciate you all helping us by filling out the poll. So the Advocacy Institute supports social justice organizations to build the advocacy skills, knowledge, and power they need to shape government policy for a more just and equitable New York. We're very excited to be with you today. Our approach is that we deliver trainings, and we have tools, including online tools and visualizations of graphics and diagrams. We help organizations build networks across the state of New York, and we also support developing and building the leadership of the folks that are involved in the organization. And all of this is about building more grassroots power to make concrete legislative and budget changes in the state to make government more accessible, transparent, and accountable. And the reason we focus on the legislative arena is because policy shapes our lives and communities. So where resources go, how power is held, and really these systems are upholding long histories of injustice in this country that we are supporting folks to work to break down. This is our team. We're small but mighty, and we all contribute to the work of the Advocacy Institute. We have members across the state of New York and a few statewide and national organizations as well. And so our agreements that we're asking you all to participate in today for the training is to please share your questions, ideas, and strategies. For every section, we'll have a Q&A section at the end of each section. So we'll have a place where you can raise hands or share questions in the chat, and we'll answer them in the Q&A section. And we know that there's a lot of wisdom in this room. So please share with each other your experiences and knowledge. We ask folks to speak from your own experience and avoid generalizing about others. And we ask folks to avoid inside baseball or language or acronyms that are only known to a small group of insiders. And part of the reason we even use this phrase is because it was originally, it came up to describe a certain way of playing baseball that was only known to the insiders in the baseball world. But it started to become pretty widely used for the field of politics. So that's why we're using that to describe this agreement. And then the other question or agreement that we're asking folks to use is to assume positive intent, but own your impact if you misspeak. So in terms of what we're going to do today, our session goals are to get an overview of our legislative campaign assessment and tracking tool, to learn strategies for building strong coalitions, to explore the importance of working across regions and issue areas, and to learn strategies to understand the needs on the ground and clarify your goals. So the first thing we want to share with you is a tool that we've developed that's called the Legislative Campaign Assessment and Tracking Tool. We developed this tool to help people sort of conceptualize the different parts of their campaign work. It was developed in response to conversations with our member organizations that are grassroots organizations working in New York for legislative and budget change. And it's a way to like help track your work and also help think about it. It provides a view under the hood of the legislative process, and it helps groups celebrate wins along the way before the ultimate policy victory that you all are going for. So Marissa's going to drop into the chat a link to the LCAT, and this is a picture of the LCAT. You'll see that it is arranged in columns, and each column represents a phase or stage of your campaign work. Now this, you could read it left to right, but we know that campaigns are not as linear or straightforward as we might want them to be. So it's really, you may jump around the columns during your campaign or go back and revisit some when things shift on the political landscape that you're dealing with. Across the top are what we call the win types, which is basically the name of each of the columns. And then within that, underneath each column are the MiniWins, which are the things that you will accomplish during each of these stages of the campaign. And the white colored boxes are internal to your organization. And green is budget and the purple is legislative, or that's the opposite way?
Green
Anyway.
is executive and purple is legislative.
Thank you. I can't see the legend right now and I forgot. So yeah, on the following slide, it talks about the what the different WIN types are. So do you mind switching to the next one? Yeah, so the various columns are the setting the stage is all the stuff that goes into like really making sure that your foundation is set for this campaign. And then the next column is the coalition building, which is all the things that go into having a strong coalition. The next one is relationship building, which is your relationships with legislators, their staff, people at agencies, to build the relationships that you need. And then across the bottom here is the categories around developing an ask, which is basically like getting your bill language the way that you want it. And then the two columns for the legislative process or the budget process, your campaign may include one of those types or may include both of those types. And then the last column is for implementation. So that, you know, after your bill is passed, then something will actually change because it's being implemented well. And so this training is really focused on those first two, setting the stage and coalition building. And you can think of these as steps in the process, but it also, since it may take a while to get to the ultimate policy win, you can also think of them as things to celebrate along the way. And they can be things that you use to celebrate with your members or also with your funders to communicate your impact. And so I will, any questions? And feel free to drop any questions in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you.
Okay, where's full screen?
For Judy in the chat, yes, we dropped a link in the chat for the LCAT, and we will also send it as part of the follow-up materials. And then someone asked about full screen. Do you? I didn't quite understand the question, but do you need assistance on that? All right, I'll turn it over to Marissa.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Corey. And that was Corey Parrish, the Deputy Director of the Advocacy Institute. I am Marissa Martin. I'm the Executive Director of the Advocacy Institute, and so happy to be with you all today. And before I jump into building your coalition, I do just want to address, I know the poll is still open for folks, and the poll is actually 3 questions, first in English, then in Spanish. And so apologies that it's required, but if you could just duplicate your answer for those questions and close it out, that would be great. And we will address this and fix it for next time. So thanks so much for your flexibility. All right, so we're going to talk about building a coalition. I just want to start by saying I know that many of you, or if not all of you, are already working in coalitions within your states, within your issue areas. The reason why we're bringing this back to really digging into the different elements of building a coalition is that often in my experience, as you expand what you're working on and you expand your coalition to new locations, you know, if you're expanding to work with different states or more statewide, it's always great to get back to the basics and really think through assessing, you know, how your coalition is run, sort of how it's governed, organized, who's at the table. And so this is really important to get back to it. So I am going to, so just kicking it off, Can folks just share in the chat what are some benefits and, or what are, let's start off, what are some challenges with coalition building that you've experienced? Just drop them in the chat and we'll populate this. And folks, it takes time. Yeah, totally. Different priorities, right? Yep, as you're talking about it, there might be different priorities. Different groups use different words. I love that. Language is so important. When coalition is compromised of volunteers, only burnout occurs. Absolutely. Even when coalitions are not just volunteers, I think burnout can definitely occur. And then getting to the right legislators. Awesome. Yeah, bridging diverse and sometimes conflicting perspectives. So finding a common ground. Yeah, being a small organization in a large geographic state with diverse cultures during a pandemic. Absolutely. Right, just getting heard in such a large dynamic. 100%. Now, what about benefits? Oh, I'm sorry, and I missed, there was DSP opens a lot of diversion. Leaders have skills, knowledge, and confidence. Who's paying to keep it going? Great. Okay, how about benefits? What are some benefits of coalition building? Great networking, connecting with like-minded colleagues, different perspectives, collaboration, power, right? Power in numbers, the joy that comes with meeting of minds and expanding perspectives. Families have credibility over organizations. I love that, Annette, thanks. Creates momentum. Unified approach, and bridging the distance between silos. Awesome. Awesome. So these are all things that I'm sure you have experience in, that you have experience in navigating, right? And really kind of assessing for your own organization or your own community. Is this coalition worth joining? And it's something that we find really important. For us at the Advocacy Institute, and I think overall in the movement space, we see that we need coalitions, right? Especially to move state level campaigns. When you're trying to change policies, you're trying to move, bodies of government, right? Legislative bodies of government or the executive office. And so it's so important that we have that power, right? Someone put in that, there's like strength in number, power in numbers. So if we can break through the challenges, right? The time it takes, the differing perspectives, the funding, it's so key for us to be able to work together and find that common ground. So awesome. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to go back. And so again, you mentioned a lot of these, right? But it fosters local organizing and infrastructure. I think where we have seen a lot of really successful coalitions excel is when, because there are folks from across the state working together, there is an infrastructure. So, we know that constantly there are changes that occur on our political landscape within our states. And so when they have that strong infrastructure, you're able to really move quickly. And then, it can be this network, this strong network that, builds community together and builds an understanding and a way to work together. They'll be able to leverage for other campaigns, right? And so once you get your win that you're working on, then you can push even harder together for implementation, or you can push even harder together on another campaign that's really important to you. And then it enables the widespread impact on issues, right? That can only be won at the state level. So we're just going to dig into a few of those mini wins that we talked about within the LCAT, the Legislative Campaign Assessment and Tracking Tool, of things to think about. And again, the reason why we created that diagram is so we know that this work takes a long time, right? We know that legislative wins can take years to feel the success to pass the bill. And so these mini wins help really think through places you can celebrate with your community, with your coalition, of just getting over a hurdle, right? Or securing a way to work together. And so we're just gonna jump into some of these. And so equipping your team, right? Legislation won't implement itself. So it's so important to think about what is the issue you're working on, who needs to be there, what staff do you need for monitoring, building agency relationships, to do outreach, to base build, to help fundraise, right? Somebody noted a challenge of that is really like, who's paying for this to keep going? And so thinking about, at the beginning of any formation of a coalition, or even assessing throughout, who do you have in the room, and who might you need more support, right? In order to equip it. And then think about who you need at the table. I loved it how somebody said, families are number one, we should be listening to them. And so thinking about who you need at the table. So it's one, very often coalitions come together organically, where folks, are talking about a same issue. They refer you to another organization, and then you have 10 organizations who agree that this is an issue, we need to work on it. But then taking a pause and saying, who else needs to be in the room, right? Who's impacted by these policies? Are we moving forward in a way that that these community members or these folks that are impacted would want, right? Or is this their priority? How will this impact them? Who has resources we might need? Who might be missing? And so an example of this that we'll talk a little bit more about is in New York State. We have a coalition called the Caring Majority. And they essentially are working on improving the pay and livelihood for home care workers. And what they realized as they were pushing for their priorities is they said, who else should be part of this? And they realized that a lot of the folks, a lot of their employers, the families, of some of the clients that they were working with, would also care about this issue, right? They also know that home care is really, really important. And so they started to invite them into the fold. And so they brought in, somebody who may not have actively been seeking this out, but who really shared the goals of what their campaign was doing. Another thing is just really from the very beginning, defining your collective goals. I think there were also those folks mentioned that as challenges of just differing opinions or differing communities coming together. And so really thinking about, what are your priorities together? It's okay if we don't agree with everything, right? A lot of times we are multi-service providers, or we are, community groups, grassroots organizing groups that care about a lot of different issues. But what is the goal that we're working towards together in this coalition? And just being really clear about it. And as a person from one organization, making sure that you're really clear about it. And then as a group that's together, pushing it, making sure you really understand, this is what we're working on together. And then folks might be working on other issues on their own, and that's okay, right? So getting really clear about that. I know sometimes I've been in coalitions where it feels like I might be pushing really hard for increasing after school programs. And then I also am working on another youth program. And it feels sort of like, oh, but do I belong to this coalition? Am I not allowed to do this other work? And so just getting really clear about that for yourself and then within the coalition. And then thinking about, what are you working on? Is it one issue? Is it one single policy ask? Is it a broader policy agenda for a community? And that's a decision that needs to be made by your entire coalition. But making sure you're having those discussions at the beginning, because when you don't have them in the beginning, they can get really messy. So again, I know you're all working in coalition, but inviting this into the conversation as you think about expanding or working across state lines and so forth. And then, sorry about this. Agreeing on a decision-making process. So really creating those shared expectations. Like these are all the things that in my experience, coalitions, we get together, we're like, let's go. We need to go to the Capitol. We need to push legislators, that we don't necessarily take the time we need to focus on this, but it's so, so important. So really talking about the expectations, talking about how you're going to govern, you know, the steering committee model, if there is one, how are you going to vote on things, right? Like we all want to have collective decision making, and sometimes there might be a time where you just need to vote. And if that's the case, how is that going to happen? What does that look like, right? And then as an organization, what are your non-negotiables, right? What is it that if that goes away, you will no longer be part of a coalition? I know for us, there's a piece of legislation, the New York State Health Act, that's being pushed for a single payer system in New York. And many of the immigration groups joined it because the language says for all New Yorkers. If that language were to be shifted, that would not include undocumented workers, those organizations may step out, right? And they were really clear about like, this is why we're joining this campaign. This is why we're bringing community in and build, you know, supporting your base. And so just being really clear about that is important. And then just, you know, logistically, we know communication, there's so much happening, especially with this pandemic and online. So just being really clear about how you want to communicate, what works best for folks. And so there isn't, you know, 15 different ways where like if there's a question that's posed or a decision that needs to be made, you need to post it in, you know, 15 different platforms. So just getting really clear on that can be really helpful and save you time. And then fundraising, right? Really, this came up, and sadly, this is a big reason why often coalitions fall. And so just keeping this in mind of how you want to do it, what works best for your community. I think something that is also helpful is thinking about the landscape, right? Are there foundations, are there partners, donors, supporters that fund and support coalitions? Are there not? Should you be doing this separately or together? I know I worked on a coalition where there were two co-leads, my organization and another. We fundraised together. And then it was very clear as we were fundraising what percentage would go to us and to the steering committee members. And that's really how we sort of kept a leadership you know, group that was bought in and needed to show up because they were receiving grants, right? For all the dollars that we fundraised. I'm not saying that is the best way or not, but there's just a lot of different ways that you can do this. So just thinking about that and exploring it. And then also just thinking about different structures that we operate in. So we know that, you know, a lot of times as we're pushing for our legislative campaigns, also being able to have an electoral strategy is important. So we know, you know, you can be your own 501c3, which is your own nonprofit organization. And these are all, you know, just tax designations. And so you can lobby, so you can directly be lobbying to legislators, but there are limitations. And when it comes to electoral work, if you're doing outreach or anything like that during elections, you just have to be mindful and be nonpartisan. So if you're having a candidate forum, you need to invite all those candidates, right? If you're having questionnaires, sending it all out to them. But just thinking this is a way that you can do it to push and introduce some of that electoral work to your coalition. And then there's also having a 501c4, which you can be more partisan, right? And so there's unlimited lobbying and you can engage in actual activity. And so when you have a large base, right, and you can push and challenge and ask folks who are running for office to commit to your agenda, you would just need this tax status. But these are all different fundraising structures. And within coalitions, you know, you can have those different organizations who represent each that can really help inform your strategy. And just a final example from New York, we had the Green Light campaign, which was driver's licenses for all New Yorkers, regardless of immigration status. And the way in which they made sure that their campaign was grounded in community was getting, you know, they had one voting rep per member group. And those member groups were representatives from all across the state, which were grassroots organizing groups that were predominantly made up of impacted communities of workers who, would benefit from having a driver's license, who currently didn't have them. And then they had a steering committee that, had directly impacted people on their steering committee to really help lead the strategy. So whenever key decisions were being made, there were the voices of the room of the impacted folks, right? So if they were asked by a legislator about what they wanted to do, they had to come forward and ask their members. So we're going to drop in the chat a coalition building worksheet. It's very, very detailed, and it's just a helpful tool. So this is, Corey mentioned the different tools that we create. And so this is just for folks to be able to go through quickly and be like, did we do all of this? Do we have all this? Or if you're engaging with new partners, maybe that's the opportunity to go through it. Use this as a way to facilitate a conversation with members. It's definitely not like you must do this to succeed. And so just independently review. There isn't one right answer. I'm sure there are other things that you have all found successful as well. So definitely, would love to hear feedback around that as well. So this is just a tool we wanted to share. And that was a lot of info, but any questions? All right, I'm going to pass it over to Corey to talk about engaging your community.
Awesome. Just a friendly reminder to, we're going to go into breakout rooms after this section. So please rename yourself with your Zoom name with 1 for Spanish or, 1 for English or 2 for Spanish in your Zoom name. That will help us create breakout groups where everyone can participate. Excellent. So you have your coalition. And a lot of times what we see is that there's a real top-down approach where the organizers and staff hold all the relationships, make all the strategy decisions, and members or people who are directly impacted by the issue are brought in just to tell their stories. How many of y'all have been part of coalitions like that? Put an exclamation point in the chat if you have. Yeah, so a lot of us have, right? That approach can win policy changes, but it doesn't build power for the long term. And sometimes it can mirror the dynamics in the larger society where the white guy lawyers who understand all the intricacies of the policy are calling the shots. But sometimes it can also be just well-meaning and experienced organizers who are so busy they forget to develop others' leadership as well. But what happens when that person leaves? The relationships may be hampered, the expertise may be limited, and the coalition can feel like they're going back to the starting block. So what really sets us up well for big wins is a bottom-up approach, where the key relationships are maintained by a broader group of people, including members. And members or people directly impacted by the issues are valued for more than just their stories. They actually are supported to lead and make decisions about the direction of the campaign. So how do you make that bottom-up approach happen? First, you have to build your base. So if you know you're going to want 300 people at the State House once the legislature is in session, then you need to, ahead of time, go ahead and do that outreach and one-to-ones and recruitment. If your organization is not the one in the coalition that actually has a membership base, this could look like making sure your coalition has grassroots groups in it, or it could be to engage with the clients or participants of the direct services group in your coalition. Then you'll also need to create the structures for your members to have real opportunities for participation. So that might mean strategy sessions or campaign meetings or steering committee meetings. And then you have to give them the support to be able to lead, which might mean trainings to build their skills. And it might also mean information and analysis of the issues that you're working on to break down complex policies, or also to give folks a framework for understanding the root causes of your issue. What are some of the ways that you've developed the leadership of your members? Drop your answers in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call you to come off mute. I know y'all have done some good leadership development. Yes, so providing one-on-one mentoring. Creating committees.
Hi, this is Annette Smith from North Carolina. We have a group of about 30 active members made up of families, nonprofits, our LMEs, our state representatives, and some policy experts. And to that, we meet every Thursday at 12 noon. And we've been doing that for a little over 20 months. And there is a steering committee that when something has to be generated to the legislators or out to the community, we have a steering committee made up of the 2 co-chairs, which are family members, and the 2 policy experts who help us, negotiate and work the proper policy systems. So that combination has worked out very well for us. We also have a public Facebook page so that anyone in the state can join, and we will share information that we think is relevant. So having that steering committee that does the specifics and then continuing to meet loyally every Thursday, we have probably 15 to 20 people who are always on that call. So just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Annette. And a lot of folks put additionally great ideas into the chat for leadership development. Some of the things that we've seen be helpful in developing member leadership are to integrate member leadership development throughout your campaign activities, to do political education on the issues that you're working on and the structures you need to shift, and to distinguish between the organization's position and members' personal viewpoints so that folks can all get behind the same message. Political education can be a great way to build the leadership of your members. One of the campaigns that happened here in New York City a few years ago was a group of homeless advocates pushing for the city to invest in community land trusts, which create permanently affordable housing that's owned by the community. So it's a very wonky issue where mostly academic folks in colleges and universities have a deep understanding of how it works. This group, called Picture the Homeless, worked with the folks in the university to train their members in all the details of the policy and who in the city government could say yes to their demands. And it was really powerful to see homeless folks advocating for with knowledge of not just the details of about both the details of the community land trust policies and the impact on their lives of having more land trusts created. Partly because they had members speaking not just to their experience, but also with expertise on the issue, they won a big investment in community land trust at the city level. So you can do political education in a number of ways, as you all mentioned in the chat and shared, having study groups, political education committees, briefings in your meetings, strategy sessions with community members. And all of those can help you decide your priorities with member leaders, which ultimately makes your campaign stronger, right? Because you're involving your community in deciding what they're willing to fight for. And then there's lots of roles that community members can play in your campaign work to keep them engaged and build their leadership over time. They can be involved in all the parts of setting up and running member meetings with decision makers and their staff. They can prep fellow members and lead workshops and forums, and they can serve as media spokespeople. It's helpful to have a variety of roles, from like low engagement, like attend a meeting, to high engagement, like join your steering committee, and lots of stuff in between, so that it's sort of a ladder that people can move up as they have interest and feel comfortable, and also that they can pick the level of engagement that matches their availability. And it's also helpful in moving folks up the ladder to have them be able to shadow folks who are more experienced in that particular skill so that they can feel more comfortable. So we're going to drop into the chat a report done by a couple of local foundations here in New York on how 2 successful campaigns engaged member leaders in their work during their fights in 2019. One for rent regulations and the other for a driver's license for all, regardless of immigration status. Marissa mentioned that coalition, the Green Light Coalition, and the other coalition is called Housing Justice for All. Both of these coalitions were statewide coalitions, partly because one of the dynamics that exists in New York is the divide between upstate and downstate, meaning New York City and the rest of the state. How many of y'all are facing geographic divides in your state, either urban versus rural or one area of the state versus another? Put an exclamation point in the chat if that's true in your state. Yeah, so that's really common, right? These campaigns were dealing with this divide, a large geography, groups that hadn't really worked together a lot in the past. And the level of experience and organizing infrastructure was really different too. So New York just has way more resources than other areas of the state. So they did a bunch of things that were successful in bridging these gaps and supporting member leadership. So they did statewide and regional convenings for people to get to know each other across geographies. They had caucuses by region or issue area so that local groups or groups of members with something in common could provide a shared perspective. For example, the Housing Coalition had a small group for homeless folks and also a group for people from the Bronx. And these groups gave those members autonomy for local issues or the issues in their area of expertise, and it also amplified their voices in the larger coalition. They did exchanges between organizations, which was really helpful for relationship building and also for building a shared sense of struggle, even though the issues were slightly different in different areas. They were really committed to language access. They had interpretation and translation of materials in their meetings, and that expanded who was able to participate. And then they also did some stipends. So members of the Green Light Campaign Gabinete, which is basically their steering committee, received a stipend for their participation to make it easier for them to take part in the campaign's decision-making. So, you know, obviously, because directly impacted community members often work in low-wage jobs where they don't get paid if they take time off, the stipend really made it easier for them to make their time available to the campaign. So like these 2 coalitions did, it can be really powerful to bring folks together on the same issue across geographies. In the case of Housing Justice for All, the housing groups across the state had slightly different issues, but brought it all together under one umbrella. The tenants in New York City were fighting for rent regulation, and upstate, there was a group working on getting a housing court in their city. You can also learn important lessons and approaches from activists in other states. So in 2010, when New York was the first state to pass the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, very soon after that, advocates from New York and other states around the country got together to form the National Domestic Worker Alliance so that the approach could be replicated in other states and domestic workers could build power at the national level. And sometimes it's also powerful to work across issue areas for a common goal. So advocates in New York have been trying for years to raise taxes on the wealthy, especially given how much ridiculous wealth there is in New York State. But the groups were working in silos with different orgs working on campaigns to tax the rich for their own issue, like education or healthcare, et cetera. Last year, the coalitions came together across issue areas to create the Invest in Our New York campaign to raise taxes on the wealthy without specifying where the additional money collected by the state would be spent. And that allowed everyone to work on it together, which built the necessary power to pass the policy. So do y'all have questions? Please feel free to drop them in the chat or use the raise hand function and we'll call on you. All right, so has everyone had a chance to rename themselves? I just have to exchange, I have to move one person to a different breakout room. So we're gonna go into breakout rooms now. And we're going to talk a little bit about your coalition and how it is okay, sorry. We're going to talk a little bit about your coalition. So the questions which Marissa just dropped into the chat are, what are your shared goals? Where may you not be fully aligned? How clear are you on how your coalition makes decisions? How does your coalition prioritize the perspectives of directly impacted community members? And if you forget what the questions are, once you go into your breakout room, you can open the chat and you'll still be able to see these questions from before. Let me just check them real quick. So you'll have 15 minutes in your breakout groups, and then we will give you a little message when there's a couple minutes left. And are there any questions before we go into breakout rooms? Welcome back from the breakout rooms. I hope that that was a productive conversation. Since we're running a little short on time, if you have any key takeaways from the breakout room, please share them in the chat with us. Any quick reflections? Remembering to go back and redefine common ground instead of assuming. Yeah, that's great. Importance of a clear process for identifying, defining, prioritizing shared issues. Building the base of the coalition seems to be critical in terms of the ground up approach. Yeah, awesome. Thank you all so much for participating in those conversations. I'll turn it over to Marissa.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. So we're going to move into the setting the stage part. So we just talked a lot about coalition building, just revisiting, right, going back to the basics. So we want to do the same. We know that you all have been working together really well within your states and together on specific campaigns, but we also wanted to, you know, ground in our goals and really ensure that those are the same, again, in the work you're currently doing, but also for any future work that you're going to be building out, any priorities and campaigns. So this is the LCAT again, and these are sort of the mini wins that we're going to be looking at. So again, we just think it's really essential for you to clarify your goals, ground in, you know, what does the community want? And so really ensure that all throughout your strategy process, as you push your campaign, that you're continuing to talk to members and community members. Many of you shared out in the chat how you do that. Some of you do all of these, right? Meetings, one-on-ones. We heard from Annette having those weekly coalition meetings and talking to them. So, you know, we just also wanted to share, there's also the other ways if you're just starting out, right? Thinking about any research or data that's already out there, or surveying, you know, surveys you've done or surveys that are out there. And then participatory action research is also another option. There's many, many ways to collect info. So sorry, we just wanted to ground in that. And then another piece when you're talking about your goals, something we like to remind our members to think about is determining the ask that you actually have. Is it to address gaps of an existing policy or program that isn't working, right? Is it something new? Or is it something with the issue with implementation? Many times we see a law pass and then the way in which the government implements it is not the way that we intended at all. And so just getting clear around what is it that you're trying to change, because we always think it's strong when coalition members or organizations know exactly how to discuss this with decision makers, right? That like, this is a new policy that we want you to pass. This is an existing policy that we think that there's some gaps or something missing here. Or this was something that was passed and we see that it's being implemented in a way that isn't supportive of our communities. So really just knowing this, you know, explicitly sort of what you want to see changed is helpful as you push elected officials, and it helps to not get kind of caught up in you know, big grand ideas that maybe elected officials have that aren't dealing with the specifics. And I know so many of you and folks who are doing a lot of this work, especially when it, you know, deals with something so specific as Medicaid funding, that you probably know a lot of the avenues and the nitty-gritty, more so than some folks in government. And so as you're doing this, again, this is just really grounding in the basics, right, as you develop these things. And so not something that you have to do just one time, something to continue to go back to. So whenever you're creating a campaign, think, is this legislative or administrative advocacy? Very often, folks will go one way or the other, right? Like, we need to pass a bill, this needs to be done legislatively. Sometimes it could be done by the administration and the executive by just having those internal conversations, especially if it has to do with implementation. So keeping that in mind. Another question we encourage folks, you know, if there's a new idea that is happening, to think about which level of government are you working on. I know all of you are working on state government because that is sort of who has oversight, but as you know, expand and are doing other advocacy, it's always great to really think about which level of government. And I think an example of this for me was I worked on legislation for data disaggregation for the Asian American community. And initially we started doing local legislation in New York City. And after talking to a lot of agencies and council members, realized that some of the agencies really reported whatever the state told them. And so then we had to shift and be a statewide campaign. And so when you really assess this and sort of ask questions in the beginning, it can save you some time. And you can, you know, it can impact your strategy about which way you want to go. And so just some terms that you all may be familiar with, but this is what, you know, things we need to keep in mind as we're determining what level of government we're going to be working on, is preemption. We see this as a vertical limit. And this is really about if the state has occupied the field, right? So if a state has a law that already speaks to whatever issue you're talking about and has a clear precedent, then, you know, if you try to do something on the local level, you might hear that's preempted, right? That is something that the state will, you know, push back, or the local government might push back and say you have to do this on a state level. Corey gave an example, you know, for us to increase our revenue for our state, it needed to be on a state level. There's very little that you can do to make an impact on, you know, a large impact on revenue on a local level, right? And so just, you know, being partners with the elected officials and your champions that you're working with to be able to push back if, in fact, you don't believe that it is a state place, because we do see this sometimes used as a way to just sort of dismiss local campaigns. So just being aware of that. Some examples of this, right, are when, like in New York City, there's mayoral control of schools. However, in order to do that, they need to go to permission from the state, right? And the state can take that away or not. We've seen this with voting rights as well as firearm regulations as well, where the federal government may have a stance, then the state government, you know, can change things, and that can limit the ability for local governments when it comes to those different issues. So just being aware of that and digging in for your specific issue. We also have curtailment, and what that is really, that's the horizontal limit. And so really, as you're trying to improve things, ensuring that, the legislation that is passed, it can't curtail the powers of the other, executives that are there. So an example of this is at one point in our history, New York City, they tried to introduce an inspector general to oversee things, and the mayor sued and said that is curtailment, that curtails my power as the mayor to appoint agency heads and commissioners and so forth. And the mayor at that time won that case. And so just being mindful of that, sometimes, all we want is for somebody to behave differently. And unfortunately, there are some legal precedents that doesn't allow that. And all of this, again, there's legal teams, huge legal teams in all of our legislative bodies. So we just share this with advocates as a way for you to know enough to say, I'll get back to you. Like, I'm going to look into that. And recognize that language, because again, so often a barrier or an inaccessibility that government can create for community is this, these terms and the legal jargon and things. So we just want folks to be aware of that. And then another key thing is to ground in your timeline. So as you plan your campaign, this is the New York State timeline. Each of your states, of course, have different legislative and budget timelines. And we always encourage advocates to really remember where you are in that timeline, right? Whether it's local or state, and so this timeline shows, the dark orange is when the heat of the budget season is happening here. And then the blue line shows, the deep legislative cycle, because in New York, our state legislature is technically part-time and they only work January to June. And so knowing when you enter in what you're up against, right? If you're entering in mid-March to the budget process, they've been doing this for 6 months, right? And so just being aware of that can help you frame your campaign and your strategy, right? It can inform your strategy, and being able to also share this with your members so that if you do go at the end of, a budget cycle or a legislative cycle, and you're really pushing, you can equip your community members to be aware of like the chaos, right, that will happen. And then if you want more spaciousness, maybe go off session to have more spacious conversations with members. So just setting up expectations is so important, and we find the timeline can be really helpful in that. And then of course, you always have to ask, legislative, budget, or both. So knowing those cycles and that timeline, and then really getting clear, is this strictly a budget campaign, right? Very often when it comes to increasing pay for home care workers and things like that, it needs to be budget. It needs to pass in the budget because it's a substantial amount. And so just being able to have that dialogue and understand. And then just what are your tactics, right? And we'll talk more about this in 2 weeks when we come together again and dig into relationship building and power mapping. But just, thinking about in coalition, organizations have a different, just act differently, right? You all have different strategies and ways that you do this work. And so thinking about the inside and outside and having those conversations with folks about who feels comfortable doing what. Is this a coalition that's going to do all of it, right? Is this a coalition that's really going to get it done by having, lots of rallies and media attention and pushing? What is the perfect model of it for your coalition? And so just being aware of that. And planning for it, right? Because each of those different tactics and strategies require different skill levels or not skill levels, skill sets. So any questions about that? I know we ran through it pretty quick, but we just want to be respectful of all of your time. Oh, and sorry, so Corey shared with you a workshop, another worksheet that we created at the Advocacy Institute for setting the stage. And that's really, kind of gives you a checklist to ask yourself all those questions. And we found that it can be really helpful, especially with campaigns that are like deep in it and moving, to reflect back and be like, did we do all of these things, right? And so because we know, again, campaigns take, many years and can take a lot of time. And so the more we can sort of assess ourselves and ask ourselves these questions, the more we can grow our strategy and strengthen, the movement and strengthen the work that you're trying to do. So any questions about anything, because we are getting close to closing? All right, so I know that we shared a lot of information in a short period of time. And so we just want to, ground in our takeaways, know your context, understand your needs and clarify your goals is a great first step. And think about the most strategic forum and way to fight for what you're doing, right? And what works in coalition. Think about how you're engaging your community and how it can help you do more when you're working in coalition and really build up that leadership. And then take the time to create that strong foundation, right? Because it's totally worth it. And it really sets you up for success as you move forward with different campaigns and new campaigns, and then continue to check in about that. So Corey has dropped into the chat a short survey. So we would love for you all to take just a few minutes that are remaining to fill that out. As a reminder, we will be sharing all of the links and the slide deck that, with you all following the training. And we are very excited to see you all in 2 weeks to dig into the relationship building as well. And so I would just, is there anything I'm leaving out, Corey or Kezia, that we want to lift up? Awesome. And we would just love to hear it if there's, if you want to drop into the chat, just like one big, takeaway that you all have. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go around the room, but we'd love to hear from you, what a takeaway that you might have gotten from today's session. And we're really excited to see you again.
Thank you so much, Marissa and Corey from the Advocacy Institute, for all of the fabulous information and practical tools that you shared with us today. We'll leave the lines open for a few minutes so folks can be chatting in their responses about takeaway. But I just want to also echo, Marissa, that we really look forward to reconvening next week for the Frameworks Institute session, but then again in 2 weeks back with the Advocacy Institute.